that feedback on episode 59 was just out of this world. That's crazy, man. One podcast back into a rhythm. I couldn't even go anywhere this last week. What about you, Zach?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's just swarmed going to my local gas station and got paparazzi, whole 9 yards. Just
Yeah,
difficult to leave the house, as you get, critical acclaim, it's just kind of something you just have to get used to. So I think, as we,
yeah,
just continue to get to new heights here, I'm sure it's just kind of a lifestyle we're just gonna have to adopt.
yeah. It's a small price to pay. I think it's worth it. The joke here is that we just recorded the previous one and we have no idea what people are going to think. Um, so I just killed the joke by telling you what the joke is. Today we're going to do a Q&A episode, episode 60 of the podcast. We are going to be regularly posting question boxes on our stories on Instagram. So if you have a burning question, you could also message it to us and we'll kind of save it, or be on the lookout for those. And hey, hopefully this is a nice little resource so that if you have a question, you can hopefully get it answered. But with that said, there's maybe a 20% chance, probably less than that, that it'll get answered because we got way more questions than we'll have time for today. So if you ask us a question through the question box, there's a chance we might answer it in a later episode. So basically how this is going to work is you ask a question, say July 2024, right? You just have to be on the lookout for that question being answered for at least the next 2 years because it might kind of resurface in our question bank. So I think that's a pretty good sales pitch. We'll go ahead and dive into question number one. This one comes from Pablo. And his question is: in which areas, if any, does your coaching differ from the evidence? I can take a crack at this, or you could take a crack at it, Zach. I'll let you make the call here.
Just picking at the outline, your answer is gonna be mine, so go for it.
All right, sweet. Yeah, I'll start by saying I think they are fundamentally like different skills or different ways to think about training. I think the goal of research is to understand the directionality and degree of effect a of the change of a given variable and give us some insight into how that might be influenced by other potentially confounding variables. And then coaching is trying to integrate that into a human's lifestyle preferences, enjoyment, trying to get some insight into how they tick, learning that individual, taking note of the obstacles they run into, getting them excited for training, trying to be good about asking questions, but not too many, so they start overthinking an ache or a pain, right? Like it's fundamentally two different concepts, but I would say that like the program design element of coaching, the foundation of that is the directionality and magnitude of effects that we can get some insight on from the research. So that doesn't answer the question though. So I'll give you something that does come to mind, and that is that I don't think there is bulletproof evidence that changes in muscle size are going to elicit changes in muscle strength. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that I I think the evidence disproves that. I think it is a very complicated question that we don't have like a clear answer to based on the evidence itself, right? So in other words, I'd say that there is a to some degree absence of evidence as opposed to evidence of absence in terms of muscle size contributing to changes in muscle size contributing to changes in muscle strength. But I would say from a coaching practical perspective, that is something that I heavily lean into and rely on. And I would just probably need to be very strongly convinced that that is absolutely not the case physiologically from the research to not do that, right? And that kind of goes hand in hand with my second part of this answer, and that is periodization. If you look at the research for periodization, for hypertrophy, um, I kind of just want to say there is no research because in a lot of ways, like the uh, data we have on periodization for hypertrophy is not the way a lot of folks would periodize for hypertrophy in the first place. So there's another case of absence of evidence, but I do think there is a place for um, periodization to some degree, but that's a very broad term. Maybe we'll save that for another episode. And then periodization for strength, I think a critical evaluation of the literature would lead someone to the conclusion that periodization itself probably isn't driving additional strength gains. You just probably need to practice the test more specifically, closer to the post-testing assessment in that study. Um, so in some ways, I don't think there's very strong evidence for periodization for strength as well when you kind of account for that. Now you could get into the nuances of like, oh, that's an inherent part of periodization, yada yada. But nonetheless, I don't think the evidence is strong for all of these things I'm mentioning, but I still use them. And some of that is because of physiological rationales I have just kind of in my own mental model of training that, in my view, haven't been fully investigated to kind of disprove them, if you will. And in a lot of other ways, it is just a practical thing that I think is necessary, right? Like I think periodization, okay, let's grant you the fact that it literally does nothing. I'm still probably going to do it because it makes training a hell of a lot more enjoyable, and at least for a good chunk of people.
That was so the strength and size thing was the first thing that came to mind. We've had a lot of conversations about this since my PhD, which we'll talk about at a different episode. But it's just my PhD has basically made me reevaluate my positions on a lot of things, and ultimately, do I have strong evidence to believe? A lot of the things that I do believe, and this was one of the ones that I came back to in terms of like, man, like as you said, it hasn't been. If I'm coming at it from a very strong priors perspective on like this definitely exists in the wild, I don't think it's been sufficiently investigated to have like that be completely challenged. That said, if you're being charitable to the other side of the aisle, I think they've it's been tried to be investigated in a lot of different ways, and there's not super compelling evidence that the causative effect of a change of muscle size on a change of muscle strength is super um, robust either. So yeah, it's a tough one. But like you said, I think there's still reason to believe why that's the case, and in practice, that's definitely something I still leverage.
Yeah.
The more of an umbrella kind of term that not term, but an umbrella concept that comes to mind for me on areas in which I do this is just things where I believe the training effort slash consistency will end up being superior. That's probably like if you had to boil things down to like, okay, this study says this is better. I do the exact opposite. Is when the preconceived beliefs or preferences or enjoyment of a client is so strongly in the other direction that I believe that terms of effort, consistency, those kind of things that they put towards training would overcome that theoretical benefit to whatever the training variable may be. So, a couple examples, like I have a couple clients who really identify with kind of the whole high intensity training kind of vibe mindset, if you will. So they would so much rather do a couple sets where they just absolutely crush themselves rather than trying to set things up in a way that I think will be a little bit more promoting of the total amount of work they can do across a month, let's say. And while I do think at the heart of heart that approach that allows us to maximize that kind of dose underneath the curve is probably going to be superior for muscle growth, I've tried to slowly introduce that in a couple different ways and they just hate it. So to that extent, like you're not really getting the benefit that you have on paper. So if this person is going to train consistently, train way more with intent, potentially really like mentally chase progression way more, and not necessarily check off the boxes that I think would be necessary for that change in volume to actually lead to a greater effect in the end. In my opinion, it's not really worth it as you're not able to really accomplish the change in your mind that you would think lead to a greater effect. So I think that's probably where I diverge the most, is just anything like that, whether it's exercise selection, picking a super short and biased bicep exercise as their kind of primary do it because they just love spider curls, like just something like that where um, yeah, for whatever reason, they just have a really strong buy into that thing. Now, there's obviously an argument to be made for a coach providing education and kind of trying to align their preferences with their goals to, let's say, optimize muscle size. If their goal is to optimize muscle size, and I really strongly believe that this will be a more effective option, there is some degree of communication that needs to be had there. But there's certain preferences and things that I think are kind of not really modifiable, and you just kind of like training in a certain way, and sometimes that's going to overrule that decision, in my experience at least.
Yeah. Well said, man. I think the change in muscle size contributing to a change in muscle strength, that's one of those topics that I feel like I need to revisit, ideally like every 3 months. That's also just not realistic. So I'm kind of due. I think we've talked about this. We're kind of due to like come at that from a new angle, because every time we do, we have what I would like to think is a better understanding of what goes into these sorts of studies and the limitations and benefits of all the different approaches from the methods, right? Like, what are we measuring, and then of course how you're analyzing that and how you're coming to those conclusions. But one more thing I'll throw out there is almost the flip side of that, and that is the changes in strength contributing to changes in muscle size. I think that is something that isn't really debated because I think it's pretty well accepted that like you don't need to bring your squat from 315 for 5 to 405 for 5. Like that's going to be the thing that permits you to use more load on the leg press and thus grow more muscle from the leg press. Like that idea I think was common at one point, but I don't think is very common these days. Um, but there are some folks that really enjoy getting stronger, but their primary goal is physique, right? So it's like, just like you said, it's like if I have someone that, let's just say they theoretically have like no preferences and their number one goal is physique oriented, um, unless they're really built for it, we're probably not going to do a whole ton of squats. But I have multiple clients that their number one goal is hypertrophy, but we still squat because maybe they used to powerlift and they just kind of like to train that way, or they've never powerlifted and they just enjoy it, right? That's cool too. Or they're limited in their equipment, and you can definitely still make that a really, really uh, effective sort of protocol. So I think we did that one justice. I'll cover the next one, Zach, and then I'll pitch the third one to you. So our second question is from Giancarlo, and that his question. We actually had a few of these questions, so I didn't write down their names though, so I apologize. And that is asking whether we have any Infinity updates. Um, I'll answer this in two parts. The first is that the cool thing about Infinity, which is our programming product that we offer, is that the updates in terms of your individual programming is built in, right? That's the whole idea behind the system. Is you take a pretty comprehensive initial questionnaire, right? It'll ask you about your sex, your training experience. It'll ask you your body weight. It'll ask if you have any kind of like preconceived preferences or better responses to different frequencies of, say, squat, bench, and deadlift. It'll ask you how many days per week you want to train. It'll even ask you some pretty nitty gritty stuff if you want to, like, hey, if you're a power lifter, to what degree do you want to really push your bicep and delt training, right? Or biceps and more particularly lateral delts, right? Like that's not something that someone that just cares about powerlifting needs to focus on. But we'll ask you because we know some people want to powerlift, but also want to fill out their sleeves, and that's cool too. So, but the cool thing is after that initial questionnaire, and then after you finish that program, you'll take a. It's actually the same quiz, but it takes you kind of down a different path to ask how it went, any changes in your preferences, give us some insight into how things went, and we kind of give you tools so that you can gain that insight into how things went, and then it'll make adjustments accordingly. something that I also really love about this, especially when chatting with folks in our community, is that you can switch between goals, right? So literally this morning, we had a post in the community that was like, hey, I am feeling a little bit burnt out of powerlifting training. The strength gains have been great, but I've been training pretty hard for powerlifting for the last like 14 months or something like that. I think they had done a handful of programs on Infinity, and they're like, what do you think about changing to a hypertrophy program? I'm like, that's exactly why we created it, so you can go back and forth between goals. So I suggested, hey, fill out the quiz. Um, Indicate that your goal is changed to hypertrophy. It'll actually carry over a lot of the previous individualization from your powerlifting program to that hypertrophy program, because directionally that stuff is going to be accurate, right? If you could bench with 30 sets on your powerlifting program, you probably are going to need more than five sets per week of chest, even if it's more hypertrophy oriented work, right? So we kind of have all of that built in. You could run that training cycle for 12 weeks. You could run it for 4 weeks, take another quiz, switch back to powerlifting, feel refreshed, feel ready to go, have some extra muscle, boom, you're good to go. Okay, sales pitch over. We do have a recent Infinity update, and that is a change to the RPE tables tab, which is within each program. So Zach did an absolutely phenomenal job of taking a recent meta-analysis by, I think it's pronounced Nuzzo and colleagues, which was published last year, took their available data and basically remade the RPE chart. So as a result, if you were to put in, say, 315 for a single at RP8 in an old Infinity program, it would spit out a different number than a new one, right? Because we've updated that RPE table chart to be what we think a lot more accurate. So that's one change, is that the standard table is new. But we've also added a little tool in there that allows you to toggle between what we call the modernized table, which is that new table, or the original table. Because some people, they just kind of want to stick with what they know. That's cool too. So they can switch between that. And I think that's a cool feature. In my experience, it definitely helps with higher rep stuff. Like the estimated 1RMs are way more accurate. So if you have a program that starts with, say fives on squat in the first block of the cycle, sometimes those estimated 1RMs are very inflated. In my view, this makes it a lot more accurate for most folks. And also, because it does so well with high rep stuff, in my view, it seems to handle the hypertrophy work way better. So if you have a protocol of sets of 8 to 12 on leg press, the estimated 1RMs might be really inflated there, especially if those leg presses become sets of 5 to 7 in a strength block, right? So things have just, I think, gotten a lot tighter in terms of the program analysis that Infinity offers as a result of that. And yeah, just it's a good product. You should check it out. And that's a recent update. Um, to my knowledge, this is the only kind of outcome oriented programming product out there. So in other words, it actually has pretty thorough. It takes a thorough look basically at your outcomes of training and uses that to inform future changes, which I think it's pretty unique in that way. So yeah, Zach, anything to add? If not, I'll pitch you the next question.
No, not really. I think, yeah, I think the RV chart was. I was excited about that. I saw that data come out, and I was like, immediately, that's where my mind went, just in terms of how many times I've looked up the RPRAR chart and just like realized what that's based on to kind of create these popular things that literally everyone in the powerlifting community uses. So yeah, I thought that was cool. I think just in a couple other things, just to mention that it does for you. The in addition to the higher rep stuff, the singles and top sets that are farther from failure, kind of inversely because of that
Yeah,
principle, will also be a little bit more accurate. So yeah, I think not to show for something that we did, but I think it's pretty cool, pretty neat. I think it updates a lot of things that allows a lot of those things to be more accurate, and consequently, like you said, because it is one of the only outcome oriented programming services, that entire process gets more accurate, more well developed, etc. So yeah, pretty stoked
yeah.
about it.
Well said. If you have a coach or you program for yourself or you're following another program, but you still want to use the chart, if you go to our link trees on Instagram, you can download the updated chart for free. And there's also 3 versions of the chart. So check that out if you're interested. Definitely want to make that available to the community at large, not just our clients. Okay. Next question. I think this is right in your wheelhouse, Zach. This comes from Ahmad. If failure is not better than 1 to 2 reps in reserve, how would lengthened supersets past failure be better for growth? He's kind of assuming some prior knowledge there of some recent studies.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. So I'll try to kind of go through this, like you said, summarize some past stuff that I think this question is kind of coming from. So first and foremost, I think where this study is, or where this question is coming from predominantly, is a very recent study that I was fortunate enough to be involved with, by Rafalo and colleagues. So I would say, in my opinion, it's probably the best single study on proximity to failure that we have in the research. I think it, within participant design, pretty well trained individuals, ecologically valid training intervention, well defined set endpoints in terms of the failure definitions utilized, and then in terms of measurement quality, the variability, the reporting of measurement error, all those kind of things, I think are just extremely well done. So to summarize the results of that paper, basically what they did is they compared one condition or one limb of an individual performing training that was 1 to 2 reps in reserve, so roughly 1.5 reps reserves on average, to a leg performing all sets to momentary failure. And roughly what the results saw, it's a little bit more nuanced than this if you dig into the paper, but for the most part, you could say that the changes in muscle size didn't appear to be meaningfully different between conditions. So that has led many people to kind of make the claim that 1 to 2 RAR is just as good as training to failure. Conversely, which actually just recently got accepted for publication, so hopefully it'll be out there in the journal formatted version here soon. We performed a exploratory project where we tried to assess the dose response relationship between RAR and muscle growth. Now, I'll save some of the nuanced details of kind of everything that had to go into that, but in my view, and we can kind of talk about this, and Josh, I actually want you to kind of talk about your framing of this, because I think you did an awesome job at your dissertation proposal kind of talking about this concept. But ultimately, the premise here is that a new study is basically telling us, and sorry, gotta reframe. In the meta regression, essentially what we found is a linear relationship between the closer to failure that you train, the better return that you get from muscle growth. And ultimately, what we're seeing with this new study coming out is people saying, well, these two things contradict. And absolutely, this is the best single study that we have on the topic. Let's go with that. I think there's nuances in the actual study design that make that a little bit more believable. And I think that also kind of agrees with our analysis. Just one example, I think the loads utilized in this study were like 10 to 12 RMs, which are roughly pretty similar to where we started to see the relationship kind of change in terms of the load utilized, in terms of where the advantage of training to failure kind of shrinks a little bit. And I think that's extremely relevant because of the fact that if we layer all of these individual pieces of study design from this one individual study, so I believe they used 22 individuals, if I'm recalling the sample size correctly. Again, very well trained. Also, like training volumes are high. All these kind of things to like signify this is a very well trained sample. And most importantly, the difference between proximity to failure is very small in the grand scheme of things. Like 1.5 reps in reserve to 0 reps in reserve, essentially. And the reason I bring that up is because ultimately what we're trying to do here, if we believe the kind of the dose response relationship is similar to what we found in our exploratory project, then you would make the claim that the difference between 0 RAR and 1.5 RAR is pretty darn small. It's there, and conceptually we can think about the dose response relationship saying that failure is offering a greater stimulus than 1.5 reps in reserve. But that actual difference between those two conditions is really small. And the ability for a project that has, in the grand scheme of things, not a huge number of participants, they did a great job, trying to maximize everything that they had in the project and had access to. I keep saying they, I was involved with it, but I'm mostly saying Martin and colleagues. But in the grand scheme of things, it's still a relatively small sample. And to be able to detect that degree of a difference would require like hundreds of participants. So, just if you just do like a basic power calculation to try to detect that effect size. So the point that I'm kind of bringing up is that this is where meta-analysis, particularly in our field, is just really, really helpful. Now, I'm not saying our meta-analysis is perfect. There are quite a few assumptions that went into it to be able to even perform the analysis in the first place. But in my opinion, I would still bank on the fact to question the premise of this question that zero RIR is probably delivering a greater stimulus for muscle growth, despite kind of this new study suggesting that things are relatively equivalent. And that's just because we need a lot of studies to be able to detect these really small effects. And so when we're able to, pool all the statistical power of all these studies in this area, we can better detect these kind of things. And so I do think that it's important to kind of look at this study individually and say, in the real world with trained individuals, it may not be a massive difference. It's not clearly in one direction versus the other, but I think this does kind of show up if you kind of go into a little bit more of the nuanced interpretation of the study. If you look at the results for the vastus lateralis versus the rectus femoris, now again, this is very much speculating with a relatively small sample, but the vastus lateralis did tend to lean in favor of the failure condition, and the rectus femoris and the kind of the opposite condition. And in every single training session, the leg press was the first exercise trained. And based on some other research, I believe by Zabalita and Corta and colleagues, if I'm recalling that correctly, for the most part, the leg press is probably going to train the vastus lateralis, and the leg extension is going to train the rectus femoris. So if we're kind of assigning the growth of those two different muscles to the different exercises and where they occur in the session, it may be that training to failure is kind of maximizing the stimulus of that first exercise, but it may harm in certain scenarios, particularly moderate to high repetition, lower body training. That's like the stock standard situation with relatively high training volumes, where the fatigue of that could potentially catch up to you to harm your performance across the rest of the session. So to start this question that I've definitely talked way too long on, I would question that premise personally. I would say that I do think failure is going to offer you a better stimulus than 1 to 2 RIR in nearly all cases. That doesn't mean that you should train every set to failure, but I think in isolation, kind of talking about physiological concepts, I do believe that to be the case. And so if that is the case, I think it makes even more sense why extending a set with a lengthened superset or continuing partial repetitions past failure. And this is coming from a different study that I'm actually going to review here in a YouTube video and an IG post relatively soon, where one condition did calf raises till they could no longer perform full range of motion reps. And in the other condition, they performed partial repetitions after they reached full range of motion failure. And so essentially they're extending that set to reach a quote unquote deeper point of failure, if you will. And to me, that somewhat starts to build a case for why that makes sense. If we say zero RER is maximizing the stimulus in theory in most situations, there's nuance, but et cetera, then extending that set further to the point where basically all range of motions reach that zero RER point, that may be even a greater stimulus per set. Now, should I do that in every single set? There's more nuance, et cetera. But that would be kind of how I view that question. Josh, I told you were going to be able to give your pitch on the small effects thing. So what did I miss? I didn't let you do that. Is there anything that I missed?
I I think we should save that for a full episode. To be honest, I think that would be a good one. We could break down the study. Um, like you said, just a phenomenal study, phenomenal reporting, um, and credit to you. But I hope you don't take this the wrong way. Like primarily credit to Martin because like just absolutely
100%.
yeah, like phenomenal reporting, phenomenal job. Like we know what goes into that, right? And we haven't done a study that high of like there we haven't kind of put all of our ducks in a row like he did for that stuff. Like we haven't done that. So like huge props to him. Like the I think we have some very high quality studies, but like for example, the training status he was able to get, we haven't gotten a training status that high. So just phenomenal job. But I think breaking down that individual study, talking about how it fits into the body of research as a whole, And that can lead to a really interesting discussion about small effects in research and um, really how to interpret individual studies and how that can inform your practice. So I think we should save it. And maybe I'll just let you continue with, I guess, this question from Ahmad regarding like how super lengthened supersets past failure could be better for growth.
Yeah, I'll try not to hammer on this too much more. I already talked about it way too much, but ultimately, yeah, if we take this concept of saying that in theory 0 RIR may be a bit more stimulative than 1 to 2, the idea would be when you do reach 0 RIR of an exercise, in this case the calf raise, which is what I believe this question is coming from. Again, the study that I mentioned was in the calf. Um, when you reach failure in a calf raise, in a full range of motion sense, you still have a lot of gas in the tank at the lower ranges of motion. And so, if we're taking the idea that reaching a point of failure in a given range of motion is what maximizes the stimulus theoretically, then doing so in only one part of the range of motion rather than the entire range of motion potentially is leaving some additional stimulus on the table. So I would say this study needs to be replicated, in my opinion. I think the Cavs are a little bit unique in the way that they, kind of interface on an exercise. So I think, like, just as a basic example, like when you reach full range of motion failure on a calf raise, there's a lot of gas left in the tank in other ranges of motion. Whereas if you were to do the same thing in a dumbbell bench press, would not be the same situation. So I don't know if I necessarily would generalize this to um, all exercises necessarily, but in concept, I do think it kind of everything kind of comes together in the sense that ideally for the set to be the most stimulative, you would basically want most ranges of motion to reach that 0 RAR point for it to be, theoretically optimal. Now, there's more testing that needs to be done of that hypothesis, but I think to me that all those kind of things that we just discussed all do kind of fit together. And
Yeah.
I think if you're looking to maximize the efficiency of a given set, right now we have evidence in the calves and probably would be okay doing that in muscles like the back, maybe that kind of similarly, you have a lot of gas left in the tank in other ranges of motion when you reach full range of motion failure. I think that's a decent thing to do as of now. Yeah.
Yeah. I think perhaps maybe the reason there is a benefit to lengthen supersets, so going past failure in the calves after you fail the full range of motion because you have so much gas in the tank at a longer muscle length. The reason we saw a benefit of that, but not a benefit in Martin Ruffalo's study of 1 to 2 RER compared to failure is that the difference in proximity to failure is so much greater in that calf study. And maybe that's why we saw an effect. We can't say that for sure, right? You would need a direct comparison to evaluate that concept, but that's probably where I lean. Now, again, we can and we
Untrained
probably
subjects
will,
as well.
yeah, untrained subjects. We can and we probably will have a full podcast episode discussing um,
Probably
maybe
all those
one or
studies,
both.
honestly.
Yeah, probably all of them.
Yeah.
But like I guess what I'm getting at is I'll layer on the fact that we're not saying that all hypertrophy training should be to failure
Yeah.
because there could also be a practical argument for why the Ruffalo study didn't show a benefit to training to failure, right? Like it's going to gas you out. So again, we'll put a pin in that for now, but definitely a lot of interesting stuff to discuss there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
Um, yeah, well, we were going to do another question, but I took up all the mic time, so I think
Yeah.
might have to wrap this one up here.
Can I add one
Like we
more thing
said,
really quick?
go ahead. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Maybe just a really quick practical take home. Super simple is that if you're doing a lengthened biased exercise, or sorry, a shortened biased exercise, so just to make sure we're on the same page, if the exercise is hardest when the muscle is at a shorter muscle length, so think hip thrust, think full range of motion calf raises, think leg extensions,
Back
think
training.
most back training, yep. Think dumbbell lat raises. Um, if you're doing those exercises, there's still fantastic exercises and can be productive, but you probably want to train those at a lower average RAR and maybe even past failure. That would be a very simple take home, I think, from the research we have right now, and give you a little practical nugget to finish this episode. But I'll let you close us off here.
Yeah, and I do want to add one more thing of caution too. Like I talked about mostly the theoretical benefits of those lengthened lengthened partials at the end of a set and that lengthened superset. I theorize that's predominantly due to that kind of proximity to failure in the different ranges of motion. Of course, it could be due to other factors that are kind of part of that equation. You're accumulating additional volume load with those partial repetitions. You're getting more exposure to the lengthened position, which generally seems to be hypertrophic. Additionally, you have that component of the proximity to failure at different parts of the range of motion. So it's not a clear and shut case of my kind of hypothesis of working everything together in kind of the proximity to failure realm. Obviously, that's kind of how I think about a lot of things given the area of our work for a lot of things. But there, of course, are other kind of moving parts there that make things a little bit more challenging, but also probably make it a little bit easier to buy the difference between the two conditions because there are those multiple factors that are kind of coming into play, which all probably independently have a small role and probably all directly contribute to the differences there was between conditions. But I do think one of those contributing factors is probably the proximity to failure at the different parts of the range of motion as well. But as we said, there's more work to be done there, and like Josh said, there's a whole podcast that we should do kind of on the just to update on the proximity to failure stuff in general, given a lot of the recent work that's come out. So we'll save that for another day. Thanks as always for tuning in. Again, please always leave your questions in the Q&A boxes that we'll more regularly post now, and we'll get to your questions in a future episode. Take care, and we'll see you guys next time.